Well, good morning. It's good to be with you today. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Ron Kretz. I'm the director of external studies across the street, and you don't see me very often. I try to get out there and visit some, but I'm usually back in that corner taking care of business and working with those wonderful folks over there. It's a delight to be here with you today. I am speaking this morning about, I've been asked to tell my mission story and talking about working with the Nationals. And that's an interesting thing because it's a big part of mission work. It's where you're going to spend, you're going to be working with the locals when you're there. Now, you may go as a team, and so you'll be working with your team, and there's all that dynamics going with that. But even when you go over there alone, like when Diane and I went over to Athens, we didn't have a team, but you're still working with the locals, the local ministers, the local people in that community, the members of the congregation, and that's a big part of it. I can remember the first time that I had to dealt with a national on a mission field, and this is when we were still students in school, and I was initially on a team to go to Mexico. We were going to plan a team. So we were on a survey trip down to the city of Morelia in the state of Michoacan in Mexico, thinking maybe this is where we want to plant a church. So we get there, and we're looking around and doing some research, find out that there's a congregation already there. So let's look them up and find out a little bit about them. So we looked up, found out where the church was. It was just right across from the state university there in a good location. And we looked up the phone number, contacted the minister, and we looked him up, the congregation, and it was really interesting. We stumbled into a hostile environment. It just kind of threw us for a loop. We go, what is this? This guy just did not seem like he wanted us to be there. He just seemed pretty cold and really just almost hostile. We're like, well, what is that all about? Well, we found out later he thought we were going to be a challenge to him. We thought we were going to come in and upset his apple cart and cause a lot of problems, which we weren't going to do. It's a big enough city, we wouldn't have gotten in his way, but he perceived that. And that was kind of an interesting thing. And so, I just took note of that. We wound up not going to the mission field. We wound up doing stateside work for 9 years up in Nebraska. And by the way, some of the things I'm going to be talking about, most of the things I'm going to be talking about, even applies in situations like that. Those of you that don't go to the mission field and wind up preaching in a congregation somewhere stateside or working with a local church somewhere, you're going to run into a lot of these same things that I'm going to be speaking about today. Because, we may not call them nationals, we'll call them the locals. We're speaking the same language in the same country, but there may be some differences that you'll have to deal with. So I wound up going, after 9 years, going to Athens as director of the associate school over there for 5 years, and I loved that work. Didn't go as a team, but I did have to work with the people that were there, and it was an interesting thing. One of the things I found, it was not the easiest thing to do. People are different. You get over in situations like that, and sometimes you just kind of feel like that guy right there. You just kind of feel like, I'm kind of worn out, and I'm just kind of beat up, and I'm not too sure what exactly I'm doing here. And then you're running into people all the time that, you just don't understand them. They're different than you are, and they're thinking different, and they're living their life differently, and things are happening here that you don't quite understand. And so you have to deal with that sometimes. And the thing about that, it can lead to a lot of loneliness. Now, in a situation in Athens, you're sitting there surrounded by 6 million people. And as I like to say, sometimes all 6 million of them are in the same metro car at the same time. It can get pretty crowded. There's people all around you. And yet, I noticed as I look around, and sometimes I even felt like that, you just feel like you're lonely as you're out there in situations like that. And you're like, what in the world? And sometimes you just feel very isolated. You just feel like, man, even though maybe there's a lot of people around me, or maybe I'm just I just feel like, you feel like periods of isolation. And of course, when you're over there, there's going to be culture shock. It's a different country. It's a different language. They do things differently than you do. Their attitudes are different than yours. And you just sometimes are like, well, why are they doing the things that they do the way they do it? And so that leads to misunderstandings and miscommunications. And sometimes you think, well, you're just wasting my time, or maybe I'm wasting your time. And so you have to deal with that culture shock. It is a real thing that you have to deal with. One of the things you find when you're in a mission field is that there's a lot of different philosophies out there. Now, I was in Athens, the land of and the birthplace of philosophy. There's Plato and Aristotle, and they've got all kinds of philosophers over there that they like to listen to. They like to study them. They're proud of all these philosophers. And this picture, of course, I think it hangs in Italy someplace. It's called the School of Athens by Raphael. Okay. I've got another picture of my students, and I call that the real School of Athens. But you get the idea, and so you have to deal with that. Now, that also applies anywhere you go, not just Athens, but you go to wherever you may find yourself on the mission field. They're going to have a whole lot of different philosophies about life, of how things should go and how things should work, and they're going to approach their religion that way, and they're going to approach ideas that way, and you're going to have to figure out, how do I deal with that? And sometimes it could be a real stumbling block. You're going to run into all kinds of different personalities while you're over there. And I'm not just talking about that cute little redhead girl on the left. But that's my wife, in case you haven't figured that out. But the one I'll talk about is Nikos Palaveras. He was our landlord of our teacher's apartment for a while, and he certainly had a different philosophy, and he stylized himself as a Greek philosopher. Oh boy, that was kind of an interesting dynamic. Now, I had a lot of good studies with this man, and he even came to our school and attended some classes for a while, and I was glad to have him, but we would study for a couple hours in the evening or for a while, and man, he'd be all twisting things around with his philosophies, and it frustrated me, and sometimes I had to pull some of our visiting instructors back and said, look, don't kill him. He's okay, he's really a nice guy, but he just frustrates you. But you run into that a lot wherever you're at. You'll be talking to people and studying with people, and you think they're getting it, and then they'll start going off on their own little philosophies, ideas, and it just frustrates you. And I love Nick to death, but he did frustrate me a lot. So you're dealing with all those different kind of personalities over there, wherever you're at. And so it just happens. And of course, then you got to deal with personality conflicts. And that could be, if you're in a team, sometimes you deal with that within your own team. But when you're without a team, sometimes you've got the local ministers and the local congregation, and there's different personalities going on in here. And sometimes there's personality conflicts. Now, I love these two men dearly. They're really good friends of mine, even today. Dino Genettos, he's on the right there, and Dino Roussos is on the left, but they're two Greek preachers. Now, have you heard the saying that whenever you get two Greeks together, you're going to have three different opinions? Well, I believe that, because these guys thought differently, they worked differently, and then what's interesting about that, they did have a personality conflict, and then sometimes you get caught right in the middle of it. Now, sometimes you want to take sides, and you want to get involved in that, and sometimes that'll just drive you crazy. I remember one time I walked in the office. It wasn't these two, but one of these two and one of the other Greek ministers, and they were sitting there. I thought, I was early on, I wasn't speaking the language hardly at all yet, and they were having what sounded to me like a knockdown, drag-out fight. And I'm like, oh, man, they're getting, really getting after it. I'm like going, whoa, what? I finally said, hey, is everything okay? Anything I can do to help? Is everything going to go to, oh, no, we're just talking about which is the best feta cheese. Is it the hard, sharp kind, or is it the soft, mellow kind? And I'm like going, I'm not going to get involved in that. But and I thought, whoa, but you see things like that. The thing about that, you have to be very careful sometimes, because you'll want to get in the middle of that. You'll want to get in the middle of some of the things that are going right here, and you have to be very careful about that, because there's an opportunity to get yourself in trouble. Turn with me over to James chapter 1 for a second. And you really have to learn to practice this. This is one of my go-to scriptures over there. I'd look this up in those times when I just feel like, I'd want to get angry, and I'd want to, get self-righteous, and you'd want to get involved in some of this stuff that you see going on over there. So I'd remember this. This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. That's true words to remember. Because sometimes you'll get derailed by everything that's going on, and you'll want to get involved in all this stuff that you don't understand, that you're thinking you're going to have some strong opinions. There was a lot of times I'd want to step in and say, look, let's do this the right way, indignantly. And it doesn't work. You have to really remember the words. Why am I here? What am I doing? What's my purpose in serving God in this place where God has placed me? And so you find yourself, you find yourself trying to fit into a difficult world. You know, I saw this, it was in the springtime, and I was walking home, and I walked up that hill all the time, back up to my apartment every day, and I walked up there and I saw this flower growing up out of the concrete. It was all by itself, and I said, I got to get my camera and take that picture. Because at that time, I felt just like that flower. I said, this is difficult. This is hard. And I'm trying to survive. I'm trying to hang on. I'm trying to do God's work. And I feel like I'm all alone here. It's a difficult... I should tell you an aside. One time, I hate to admit this, but one time I'm sitting there, Diana and I were walking up that same hill, kind of in that same area. And I was just worn out from the day. I was just right in the middle of culture shock. And I actually just stopped in my tracks and sat down on that sidewalk. I said, I don't think I can take another step. Diane looked at me and said, get up, Ron, you're embarrassing yourself. So I got back up and we kept walking. But that's what you got to do. She remembers that. She's like, I remember that day. It was kind of a rough day. And that's where this one fits in. 1 Corinthians, we just read that right there. And I love that scripture. Another one of my go-to scriptures. Why are we here? I'm free to do what I want. I can go wherever I want, right? I can do that. But, hey, like Paul, have we not made ourselves doulos, slaves for the cause of Christ? We need to remember that. We need to kind of adapt. Now, I'm not, anything. What we got to remember is when we read this, we're not talking like we have to participate in the sins that they're doing or get involved in immorality they might see around us. But we do need to become all things to all people so that we can reach them. That means we need to strive to gain a little bit of understanding. We kind of have to seek to fit into their shoes a little bit. In other words, let me walk a little bit with you so I can understand where you're coming from a little bit. And why do we do that? Well, we're doing it for the gospel. One, that we can become fellow partakers of it and save some. And reach out and make a difference. And that's what we need to keep that foremost in our mind. We need to keep that in our mind. So here, how do we get along? What are some tips? What are some attitudes to consider? And how we can do this? One of my other go-to scriptures, and I've got a bunch of them, but I don't have time to share all of them, but I want to share one very important one with you. Turn with me over to Psalms chapter 139. A Psalm of David. We can relate with David. Sometimes we find ourselves messing up greatly in this world, trying to serve God in a world that's hostile, that seems like it's against us. But I love to read what his words talk about right here. I may ask the question, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? When things get turbulent. Life is going to get turbulent. I mean, it even gets turbulent right here, doesn't it? Wherever we're at, wherever God plants us, life gets turbulent. And we need to remember. I remember these words. If I ascend to heaven, you're there. There's going to be times when you find yourself looking up. I remember when I took this picture, and I looked up there, and here's a big temple monument right there, and I see that airplane up in the sky, and I saw the moon right there. I said, I got to get that picture, because sometimes that's me. I find myself I'm looking up to God, and I see the world moving, and I see the world in all its majesty, and I see the world right there before me. And got to remember, God's there. God's there. And there's going to be times when it just seems like you find yourself looking down and you see the ugliness and dirt of this world and everything that's going on in here, and you just got to remember God's there. I didn't take this picture. A lot of these pictures I took, but I didn't take that one, because when they rioted in Athens, you stayed home, watched it on the news. But there were pictures, and this is a picture of one of the bad riots that was going on down there. They nearly burned down downtown Athens in December 2008. But it gets really bad. But sometimes that feels like the world's burning down around you, and it just feels like everything seems to be looking down, and that's where you may find yourself sometimes. But you've got to remember, God's there. God's going to be there for us. And there's going to be some times when you just may take thought of just, I want to get out of here. I just want to take flight. And if it's, well, if I take my wings of the dawn, and if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, that's what I might desire to do. That's what we may want to do. There's sometimes we may just say, I want to kind of like Jeremiah at times. He would say, I just want to go away. I just want to go someplace else and get out of here. And escape it all. But we can't do that. Because we need to remember that God will be there to lead us. His hand will be there to help get there. And we can know that God will be there to be our good shepherd, to be our good leader, to provide us that comfort and sustenance we need if we just stay connected to Him, stay part of His flock. That is so important. Even when you're out there alone in this world and it seems like you're alone, you're not really alone. You've got God's family around you. We've got to remember that, wherever they can do that. We need to hold on to that. And we need to hold on that God's going to grab a hold of us. And I'm reading, if you're following along, I'm reading right along with that psalm right there. God's going to lay His hands on us in those times. When we're dealing with the nationals, we're dealing with that culture shock, when we're dealing with those difficulties of all those obstinate people that we seem to be working with and around us. God's going to lay His hands on us. And we can remember that. The darkness may sometimes want to overwhelm us, and it might even seem to get really, really dark out there. And and it may seem like it's really, really light, and it may seem sometimes like that path is really, really dark, but we need to understand that His light's going to continue to shine. I took this picture in Patmos. I can imagine John got very lonely on that island. When he spent that time in exile. But we got to remember, even the darkness is not dark to God. His light's going to shine for us, even in those dark times. And then we can remember while we're there. We can know that God is taking care of us, and His light's going to continue to shine, even in the times of darkness. This is Johannes Walderige. I look forward to seeing him in heaven someday, because he's since passed away, but I could spend an hour talking about his story. But he's an Ethiopian, wandered in the door one day, asking about what's going on here. So we studied, and he became a student in the school, graduated. But I was so delighted the day I baptized him. And that's why we're there, to reach out to those that are seeking and looking for light, that are looking for a difference. It was so awesome. When he came out of that baptismal pool, he raised his hands and he said, there'll be no more dying, there'll be no more crying. He was a great man. He is a great man. He's with our Father now. He's since passed away and gone home. But that's why we're there. That's why we go there. That's why we put up with the nationals. That's why we put up with the conflicts, and then why we put up with with the personalities, and we put up with all these, all these differences that we don't understand, and the culture we don't understand, the language we don't understand. God's light will be victorious in all of that. And even those little victories, like, I could tell you countless stories of others that we were able to reach out to over there in Athens and baptize and bring them out of the darkness. But even if you just reach out to one and make a difference, isn't that good enough? Isn't that awesome? You know what's interesting today is today, right here, right now, wherever we find ourselves in the mission field. And we find ourselves standing at the bema. Now I have to tell you about this story a little bit. I got a few seconds left. This is the judgment seat in Corinth, Corinthos, where Paul stood before Gallio, the proconsul. The Jews drug him before that. You read about this in Acts 18:18. And that's the spot. Archaeologists sometimes can disagree where things happen, but just about universally everybody says that's the spot right there. That's probably where Paul stood. He was ready to defend his faith. Now, somebody else got beat that day on his behalf, but Paul was ready to defend his faith that day. And we need to be ready to stand our faith today. Now, this is Ivo Ibong, a Cameroonian, graduate from the school, baptized him also. We were taking a tour of this place that day with our students. Many of them hadn't been to Corinth. They were thrilled to be there. And the seniors who were taking 1 Corinthians at the time, I told them, I want you to give a little report about what you learned in this book at different spots as we go along this tour. And I picked Ivo when we got to the bema. His eyes got real big. He got up there and did a wonderful job. He got done. His wife beat him, but he came over and gave me a big hug. I said, I want to thank you for what you've done for my husband. And then Ivo came over and gave me a big hug. He said, I want to thank you for letting me preach the spot where Paul stood one time. That's what makes it all worthwhile. Wherever you find yourself, wherever God puts you. You see, we're about the business of bringing His light into the darkness of this world. We need to continue to preach and teach His Word.